Enron paid its own employees to destroy the company. That's the uncomfortable version of the story that most retellings skip past. In 2001, Enron collapsed in one of the largest corporate bankruptcies in American history, and if you only remember one thing about it, it's probably accounting fraud. But the real mechanism is more specific and more useful than that label suggests. The collapse traces directly back to how employees were paid, not just how the books were kept. Understanding exactly how that worked tells you something almost every manager needs to know about their own bonus structure. Start with the accounting method itself, because nothing else makes sense without it. Enron used mark-to-market accounting. In plain terms, this is a method that let the company book projected future profits from long-term deals immediately, the moment a contract was signed, regardless of whether that money had actually been earned yet. Picture a 20-year energy supply contract. Under normal accrual accounting, you'd recognize revenue as it's actually delivered, year by year, as cash and value change hands. Under mark-to-market, Enron could estimate the entire projected profit of that 20-year deal, discount it to a present value, and book the whole thing as earnings today. The contract might perform exactly as projected. It might not. Either way, the number hit the income statement immediately. To make the mechanism even more concrete, think about the difference between two ways of measuring the same deal. Under an approach anchored to cash actually received, a 20-year contract shows up on the books gradually, a little each year, matching the pace at which the customer actually pays and the service is actually delivered. Under mark-to-market, the entire projected value of all 20 years gets pulled forward into the present, based on assumptions about future energy prices, future demand, and future costs that, by definition, haven't happened yet and can't be fully verified at signing. The gap between those two approaches is where the danger lives. It's not that projecting the future is inherently wrong. Every business plan involves some forecasting. It's that treating a forecast as equivalent to realized cash for the specific purpose of determining how much an employee gets paid this year removes the natural check that normally keeps forecasts honest. Nobody has to wait to find out if the forecast was right before collecting the reward for making it. That accounting choice, on its own, is a judgment call with real defenders in certain financial contexts. It becomes dangerous specifically when you attach compensation to it. And that's exactly what Enron did. Employee bonuses were tied closely to reported earnings. Once you connect those two systems, the fastest way for an employee to boost a bonus stopped being build a genuinely profitable long-term deal that performs well for 2 decades. It became structure, a deal that looks profitable on paper, immediately, whether or not it holds up over time. Those two goals sound similar. They are not the same goal. One requires patience, discipline, and tolerance for deals that take years to prove out. The other requires speed, optimism in your projections, and volume. This is where the incentive structure created what economists and psychologists call a misalignment between measured performance and actual value creation. The accounting system let projected profit count exactly the same as real, collected profit for bonus purposes. From the point of view of an individual employee trying to maximize their own compensation this year, there was no rational reason to prefer the slower, harder path. The system had already told them, through the paycheck, which behavior it valued. It's worth pausing on how ordinary this dynamic feels once you strip away the Enron name. Imagine a sales team where commissions are paid out the moment a contract is signed, with no clawback if the customer cancels within the first year. Salespeople will rationally prioritize closing volume over customer fit because the system pays out at signing, not at renewal. Imagine a software team where features shipped is the tracked metric, with no corresponding measure of whether those features actually get used or reduce support tickets. Engineers will ship visible, demoable work over invisible reliability fixes because that's what gets counted. Enron's mark-to-market bonus system is the same dynamic, just running at a much larger scale and with much larger dollar figures attached. The mechanism generalizes far beyond one energy company in Houston. Consider one more generic scenario, deliberately unconnected to any specific real company, just to see how far this generalizes. Imagine a manufacturing plant where line supervisors are evaluated and bonused on units produced per shift, with quality inspection handled as a separate downstream process weeks later. Supervisors will rationally push for speed because speed is what's measured and paid in the moment that matters to their bonus, while defects surface later, attributed to a different part of the process, disconnected in time from the decision that caused them. Or, imagine a customer support team bonused purely on tickets closed per day, with no corresponding measure of whether the customer's actual problem got solved. Agents will rationally close tickets fast, sometimes prematurely, because closed is what's counted, not resolved. None of these hypothetical teams need to be staffed by dishonest people for the pattern to appear. The incentive design alone is sufficient to produce the behavior, which is exactly what happened inside Enron's trading and deal-making units at a much larger scale. Employees who aggressively pursued this strategy at Enron were rewarded and promoted. This detail matters more than it first appears to. It means the incentive wasn't just tolerated quietly at the margins. It was actively reinforced through career advancement, which is one of the strongest signals an organization can send about what it actually values, regardless of what the mission statement says. Once the people getting promoted are visibly the ones playing the mark-to-market game hardest, everyone else in the building receives the message without anyone having to say it out loud. Nobody needs a memo instructing them to inflate projections. The org chart does the instructing. Here's a useful comparison, because this pattern is not unique to Enron and it has a name. It closely resembles what's known as Goodhart's law, often summarized as when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. Enron's leadership wanted profitable long-term energy deals. What they actually measured and rewarded was reported earnings under a specific accounting treatment. Once employees knew that reported earnings, not eventual real performance, was the target, they optimized for the target, exactly as the law predicts. It's also a textbook case of what's called a principal-agent problem, the classic tension in economics between what an organization's owners want and what its employees are individually incentivized to do when their interests aren't actually the same thing. Shareholders wanted durable value. Employees, quite rationally given their pay structure, wanted this quarter's number to look good. There's a related concept worth naming too: moral hazard, the idea that people take on more risk when someone else bears the consequences of that risk. Employees booking optimistic projected profits weren't the ones who would personally absorb the loss if a deal underperformed years later. The company, and eventually its shareholders and employees more broadly, absorbed that risk instead. There's a broader category this fits into as well, one that shows up constantly in management and finance literature: short-termism, the tendency of incentive systems to reward whatever looks good in the current measurement period at the expense of value that only shows up years later. Executive compensation tied heavily to quarterly stock price, sales incentives tied to this month's closed volume, and manager bonuses tied to this year's headcount reductions all share the same underlying shape as Enron's mark-to-market bonuses. In every case, the person making the decision captures the reward immediately, while the cost, if there is one, lands on the organization later, often after that person has already been promoted, paid, or moved on. Enron is simply the most extreme, most thoroughly investigated version of this pattern, which is exactly why it became the textbook case, rather than just one more forgotten scandal. Now, here's the part nobody expects when they first hear the story reduced to Enron committed fraud. The incentive problem didn't stay contained to just optimistic accounting. When some of those long-term projected profits failed to materialize as promised, the company faced a choice: report the shortfall honestly, which would hurt earnings and expose that the earlier projections were too rosy, or find a way to keep the number looking healthy. Enron increasingly relied on complex off-book entities to hide the resulting losses and keep reported earnings looking good, a practice that eventually unraveled entirely in late 2001. This is the pivot point of the whole story, and it's the part that turns an aggressive but legal accounting choice into an actual fraud. The bonus-driven push toward optimistic projections created losses. Hiding those losses to protect the appearance of ongoing success is what finally brought the company down. And it's also what turned a story about incentive design into a story about outright deception. It's worth noticing the psychology of that second step, because it's not unique to Enron either. Once a projection has already been booked, as earnings and bonuses have already been paid out against it, admitting the projection was wrong means clawing back something that already happened, publicly. That's a much harder thing for an organization to do than simply not booking the optimistic number in the first place. The incentive to hide a shortfall compounds the original incentive to overstate it. Each layer of covering up makes the next layer of covering up feel more necessary, not less, because the gap between reported numbers and reality keeps growing the longer it goes unaddressed. Investigations afterward found the incentive structure wasn't an accident or the work of a few rogue employees. It was a system-wide alignment where personal financial reward consistently pointed toward exactly the behavior that ultimately destroyed the company. The scandal was significant enough that it also brought down Arthur Andersen, the accounting firm that had audited Enron's books, and it contributed directly to the passage of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act in 2002, which reshaped how public companies handle financial reporting, executive certification of results, and internal controls in the United States. That regulatory aftershock is itself a data point about scale. This wasn't a minor internal control failure, it reshaped corporate governance rules nationally. Enron's downfall is now taught constantly in business ethics and incentive design courses specifically because of this alignment problem. And it's worth sitting with why that specific framing has staying power decades later. It's not primarily a story about a handful of bad actors deciding to lie. Individual dishonesty was certainly part of the final chapter, but the larger part of the story is about a large number of otherwise ordinary employees responding rationally to a system that consistently paid them for the wrong thing. That's a more uncomfortable lesson than some executives were crooked, because it doesn't let anyone off the hook by treating this as unusual or pathological. It suggests the same dynamic could show up in any organization that isn't paying close attention to what its incentive structure actually measures. Here's my own take on why this still matters so directly for managers today, beyond the historical trivia. Most people don't wake up in the morning intending to be reckless or dishonest. They wake up and respond to whatever signals the organization sends them about what gets rewarded. A bonus structure is not a statement of values. It's closer to a set of standing instructions running in the background of every employee's daily decisions, and it doesn't care what the company handbook says about long-term thinking or customer first. If the instructions and the values conflict, in practice, the instructions win, because instructions are attached to paychecks and values usually aren't. So what does a manager actually do with that? A few concrete moves follow directly from the mechanism above, not from a vague moral about honesty. First, audit what your bonus and commission structures actually pay out on, not what you intend them to reward. If bonuses are keyed to projections, pipeline value, signed contracts, or self-reported numbers rather than collected revenue, retained customers, or outcomes verified after enough time has passed to know if they held up, you have a version of Enron's problem sitting quietly inside your comp plan, just at a smaller scale. Second, build in delay and clawback where it's feasible. Paying out compensation tied to a deal's full projected value on day one removes any incentive to care what happens on day two. Staggering payouts against actual delivered performance, or including clawback provisions when projections don't hold up, reattaches the incentive to reality. Third, separate the people who report a number from the people who are paid based on that number, wherever practical, so there's a natural check, rather than one group grading its own homework. Fourth, watch who gets promoted, not just who gets paid. Enron's promotion patterns sent as loud a signal as its bonus checks did. If your fastest promoted people are the ones producing the most optimistic-looking numbers rather than the most durable results, that's the same signal dressed up as career advancement instead of cash. Fifth, make it cheap and normal to report a shortfall early. Part of what turned Enron's incentive problem into a criminal one was that the organizational cost of admitting a projection was wrong had become enormous. If your team believes flagging a missed target early is safer, professionally, than quietly patching around it, they'll flag it early and you'll catch the small version of the problem instead of the large one. Sixth, Treat the review of your incentive structure as a recurring exercise, not a one-time setup. Bonus plans get designed once, often with good intentions, and then run unexamined for years while the business around them changes. A metric that made sense when the company was small can quietly turn into an Enron-style trap once volume, complexity, or time delay between decision and consequence grows. Revisiting the question, what does this plan actually pay people to do, in practice, right now, on a regular cadence, catches drift before it compounds into something structural. None of this requires assuming your own team is dishonest. That's precisely the point that makes the Enron case so useful as a teaching example, rather than just a cautionary tale about villains. Most of Enron's employees were, in all likelihood, ordinary professionals doing what any rational person does when a system consistently rewards one behavior. They did more of that behavior. The lesson isn't just about honesty, and it isn't solved by hiring more honest people. It's that a bonus structure will get exactly the behavior it rewards, whether or not that behavior actually serves the company's real, long-term interest, and it will do this regardless of the integrity of the individual people inside the system. Design the incentive first. The behavior follows on its own, department by department, quarter by quarter, until the gap between what looks good on paper and what's actually true becomes too large to hide. If this sounds like your office, follow for more.